Welcome to Nazarene, Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and this presentation is on the Feast of Tabernacles, or what's called in Hebrew, Sukkot, and why this feast is so important and why every believer on the Jewish Messiah needs to be keeping this feast. As we saw, just briefly to recap, as we saw in earlier portions of this video series, the three main phases of the ancient Hebrew wedding correspond to the three main pilgrimage feasts. To briefly recap, the first phase in the ancient Hebrew wedding is called Shidduchin, and we see this symbolized in the Pesach or Passover. Now, this is when the match takes place. So anciently, Abraham sent his servant Eliezer to find a bride for his son Yitzhak or Isaac. So there were gifts given, there was an agreement made, and then there was a covenantal meal to seal the deal, so to speak. And we see this also taking place at the very first Passover when Israel was taken out of Egypt. They also shared a covenantal meal, was the very first paschal lamb. We also see this in the first century when Yeshua took his disciples as his bride. Not just every believer, but the disciples were the bride. Okay, but the marriage is not official at the private covenantal meal. When they go to announce the wedding, that is when the marriage becomes both legally and lawfully binding in the ancient model. This is the phase called Erusin, and we'll see that this corresponds to Pentecost or Shavuot. So at Shavuot or Pentecost, at the Erusin phase, there's going to be a public announcement of the wedding. Okay, so at the public announcement, that's when the marriage becomes lawful and binding. Okay, the consummation, and typically speaking, Erusin would take place before the growing season, and then the consummation would not take place until the end of the growing season. But the marriage becomes official at the announcement. That's because in ancient times, it was the agreement that was considered the main thing, because that's where we get the saying that a man is only as good as his word, or a woman is only as good as her word. So don't be giving your word that you're going to marry someone and then go back on it. That's considered not cool. That is not okay in Scripture. But there would be an agreement, and typically speaking, you want some kind of a witness of that agreement. Either there's a written witness or a public witness, or you would have to have witnesses. So we see these witnesses at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And in fact, the Torah is a written witness of the marriage agreement, what's called a ketubah. So the bridegroom is going to offer certain things, and then the bride is going to promise to do certain things also. So there's a give and take on both sides. We see this also in the outpouring of the Spirit in Acts chapter 2. So at the giving of the Torah, Yahweh said, "You will be my bride, but I want you to do these things." And Israel said, "I do." And then at the outpouring of the Spirit in Acts chapter 2, the idea was, Yeshua said, "I want you to live by my Spirit 24/7 and not quench it." So that's the agreement. We need to receive his Spirit and then live according to it and not quench it. That's the big idea behind Acts chapter 2. So all that would take place before the growing season or at the start of the growing season. And then over the summer or during the growing season, the bride and the groom both prepare. So the bride would work on her wedding dress. She would also communicate with the groom through the groom's best friend, which in Yeshua's case is the Spirit. So we have the indwelling of the Spirit, received it first at Acts chapter 2, and then we become more and more like him. That's our job, is to learn what he likes, to become more like him. Well, the groom's job then is to add on a room to the Father's house where we shall live together with him. And that's why he says, "I go to prepare a place for you." And he says, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." So at the end of the growing season, or at the end of the summer, when everything is prepared, and the bridegroom's father says that everything is prepared, and he gives his groom permission to go get his bride, then the bridegroom would send a herald to announce his arrival with 7 shofar blasts. And we're going to see later that these correspond to the 7 trumpets of the tribulation. And this alerts the bride and her bridesmaids that the groom is coming. Traditionally, this is the significance of Yom Teruah. So the bride and her maids then light their lamps and they get ready to go out to meet the groom and his wedding party, but they have to have enough oil. They have to have enough of his spirit. So traditionally, the bridegroom returns around midnight on Yom Kippur. And as we already said, the 7 shofar blasts correspond to the 7 trumpets of the Great Tribulation. We'll look at that again in a moment. And this is why Yeshua says in Matthew or Matityahu, chapter 25, starting in verse 6, at midnight a cry was heard, "Behold, the bridegroom is coming. Let's go out to meet him." So then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. Okay, this is the phase, the final phase of the ancient Hebrew wedding called Nisuin. Nisuin means carried aloft. And what it symbolizes is how the groom would literally carry his bride aloft from her father's house back to his father's house. And that's where the consummation would take place. And then they would have the week-long wedding feast. They wouldn't go somewhere on a honeymoon, but they would take a week off, and then everyone would get to meet the bride under festive circumstances. So they have good first impressions of the bride, and she gets to meet everyone at their best. Everyone's having a good time because the harvest has been brought in. So there's plenty of food and everyone's relaxed. So they begin their relationship and their new lives together on a good note. So in the days of Abraham's servant Eliezer, Rivka rode back to Yitzhak's house or Abraham's house on a camel. And then in the first century times, they would have a special booth. They would actually carry the bride in a litter, so to speak. Well, okay, so we have to be ready for the wedding feast, and that's our job right now as we're preparing for Yeshua's return in these end times. We need to be gathering oil. We need to be gaining more of his spirit. We need to have enough of his spirit so that in case the bridegroom is delayed, we don't run out of his spirit, so to speak. So Yeshua speaks to this in Matthew or Matityahu, chapter 25, starting in verse 8. The foolish virgins said to the wise virgins, "Give us some of your spirit, for we're running out." The wise are like, "How can I do that? How can I give you his spirit? It doesn't, I can't. You have to go get it for yourself." But that's the difference between a wise virgin and a non-wise virgin. The wise virgin is going to be praying and listening and asking for the gift of his spirit. She's going to be trying to live according to the spirit, not quenching the spirit. She's going to be attempting to hear and obey his voice. She's going to be praying for the gift of prophecy so she can hear Yahweh's voice and speak according to it. That's what we need to be doing right now, because anyone can see that Matthew 24 is knocking on the door. So here we are in Matthew 25, and the wise answered, saying, "No, you have to get the Spirit for yourself." And notice the correspondence between Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. So while the foolish virgins are going to buy because they don't have enough in these end times of tribulation, that's when the bridegroom came. And those who were ready, meaning those who had enough of his spirit, those who were not quenching his spirit, those who were falling on the stone and being broken, and were seeking and praying and begging that he might help them to live according to his ways, so they might be pleasing to him in that day. Those were the ones who were ready to go with him into the wedding, and the door was shut. And the others who were not doing that, what are they doing? They're trying to get more of his spirit, but it's too late. So we need to be preparing now, right now. Because afterward, the other virgins came also saying, "Adon, Adon, Master, Master, open to us." But he answered and said, "Assuredly, I say to you, I don't know you. Because to him who has, even more will be given. But to him who does not have, even that which he has will be taken away from him." And he says, "Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming." And so that's why we're going to talk in this section about how to get ready for his soon return. So in addition to having enough of Yeshua's spirit to make it through these coming tribulation times, it's going to be more difficult than anything the world has ever seen, by far. Much, much worse than we can even imagine right now. There's things that aren't even explained in the book of Revelation. The seven thunders, we don't even know what those are. That's how difficult these end times are going to be. We need to be getting in tune with him. We need to be hearing his voice. We need to be falling on the stone and becoming broken. But we also need to be there at the right time. We don't want to be a month late for our own wedding. Oy vavoy. Why would you want to be a month late for your own wedding? So we need to know, when is the wedding feast? So we've been talking about this, as we've said in many other videos. We've got many other resources under the playlist. Establishing the head of the year. We also talk about this in the Torah calendar study. Rosh Hashanah, that's the head of the year. Now, the rabbis say it starts in the fall. Don't pay attention to the rabbis, especially not for the calendar. But Rosh Hashanah, or the head of the year, you also have to avoid the Karaite message, because the Karaites are a month too late. They're going on the phases of the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's not good. But so Rosh Hashanah, or the head of the year, that's when the very first sheaf, not the main harvest, but the first sheaf of barley, will be aviv, or medium dough, 15 to 21 days after the first crescent sliver of the new moon is seen from the land of Israel. That's when the priesthood declares Rosh Hashanah, or the head of the year. Then 6 months later, we come to Yom Teruah, which is the day of trumpets. Actually, it's the day of shouting, or the day of shofar blasts. And then 15 days later begins the 7-day Feast of Tabernacles, symbolic of the ancient Hebrew wedding week. We need to be there. Don't be late for the wedding. That'd be the worst thing we could do. Now, in the Torah calendar study, we talk about some very important mirror imaging in the prophetic shadow pictures of the feasts. And we're going to talk more about this also in relationship to the wedding in another place, because we could, the ancient Hebrew wedding is just fabulous. It explains the whole thing. It gives such a good picture, but we also go into great detail in the Torah calendar study. So in the feast of the first month, we have the Passover, or Pesach, which is a half-day feast in the afternoon, followed by 7 full days of unleavened bread, or matzot. Okay, so it's a half a day in the afternoon plus 7 full days. Then we come to the 7th month, and now we have Sukkot, or Tabernacles. There's going to be 7 days dwelling in Sukkot, which is symbolic of the wedding week, or the consummation of the wedding week. Plus, we're going to have a final half a day in the morning, which is Shemini Atzeret. We're going to talk about that next week in the next installment. So in the first month, we have half a day plus 7. In the 7th month, we have 7 full days plus a half. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the specifics, and then we're going to drop into some detail here, because the details are important. We're going to see this near the end of the presentation. In Leviticus, or Vayikra, chapter 23, starting in verse 33, Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be Chag Sukkot," and that's the Pilgrimage Feast of Tabernacles, for 7 days to Yahweh. And on the first day, there's going to be a set-apart rehearsal, or a holy convocation. What is it a rehearsal of? It's a rehearsal for the wedding feast. So it says, you shall do no customary work on it. We're going to see other things that it's a rehearsal for as we progress through this presentation. He says, for 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. And then on the 8th day, we'll talk about this next week in the next installment. On the 8th day, you shall have another set-apart rehearsal, or holy convocation. We'll talk about that next week. And you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. It also is a set-apart assembly. You also shall do no customary work on it. So we have basically don't work on the first day and the 8th day. And then it's possible to work on what are called the intermediate days, but if you can take the whole week, that's much better. Verse 37. He says, these are the feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be set apart gatherings, to offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh, a burnt offering and a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything on its day, besides the Sabbaths of Yahweh, besides your gifts, besides all your vows, and besides all your free will offerings, which you give to Yahweh. So basically what Yahweh is saying here, and a lot of people hate this message, there's an awful lot of people who want to be brides who don't want to give of themselves to help Yeshua build his kingdom. But if a bride is described as a helper or a helpmeet, we need to be helping him build his kingdom. And how do we do that except with our time, our effort, our energy, and our funds? So that's how it is. There's a lot of people don't want to hear that, but that's what this speaks of. So in particular, with regard to Sukkot, there's several messages with regard to this, and we'll talk about these as we progress. So Leviticus or Vayikra 23 and verse 39, it says, also on the 15th day of the 7th month, the first day of the Feast of Sukkot, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, and we're going to see that that's basically another way of, you've brought in the harvest. So it's at the end of the summer growing season. We've brought in the harvest. So now this is a good time for tithing. So when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of Yahweh for 7 days. On the first day, there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day, a Sabbath rest. We'll talk about the 8th day rest next week. He says, and you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim for 7 days. And we'll take a look at these, what are called the 4 species later on, and we'll take a look and see how it's turned into the 5 species of Nehemiah. But this 4 species, we'll talk about that more later on. Verse 41, he says, you shall keep it as a feast to Yahweh for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. Now, when we see that kind of language, that's what's called a principle or a precept. So in other words, the form of the Feast of Tabernacles may change, but it's something that is for all time, no matter whether we're under the priesthood of the firstborn, under the Levitical priesthood, or under the Melchizedekian priesthood as we are right now. Verse 42, you shall dwell in Sukkot for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths or Sukkot or tabernacles. We're going to talk about the difference between a tent and a tabernacle in just a minute. He's saying, why should we do this? Okay, well, because it's symbolic of the wedding feast, but also, so that tells us what our future is, but also we need to know what our past is. He says, also, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths or tabernacles when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your Elohim. And we're going to see that we will again dwell in booths. So this is a very, very, very symbolic feast. Okay, a lot of people want to celebrate the Feast of Sukkot by dwelling in tents. And that's a good thing to do because we will again dwell in tents. But there's a difference between a tent and a tabernacle. Now, the two terms are sometimes used interchangeably, and we'll take a look at that. We talk about that more in the Torah calendar study. But the term tent is Strong's Hebrew Concordance, Old Testament 168. That's an ohel, not a sukkah. It's an ohel. And it comes from Old Testament 166. It means a tent. It can be translated as tabernacle in some places. There is also a reference to the tent of David, but we'll talk about that in more detail in the place. We're just trying to hit the basics here. The Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Sukkot is something different. So a sukkah is Strong's Old Testament 55:21. Sukkah. That's in the plural, it's Sukkot. It's a feminine plural. And then in the singular, it's a sukkah. Technically, it means a hut or a lair, but we're going to see it's something woven together. The King James translates it as a booth or a tabernacle or a tent. We look up the reference at Old Testament 55:20 because we love doing that. We see it's sok. It's from Old Testament 55:26. It refers to a hut as of entwined boughs, so that something is being woven together. We're talking about these four species later. And again, King James translates it as a tabernacle. So then we look up the root reference at Old Testament 55:26, and that's sakach. And that's a primitive root. And properly what it refers to is entwining as a screen. So in other words, we're going to take these four species that we're going to see and we're going to entwine a screen. The implication is that something, us in this case, is being fenced in. And this fencing figuratively protects. So King James uses this word also to say to hedge in, to join together, or to shut up, meaning to fence in, also to defend or to cover or to defend. So in these various general senses. And the thing about a sukkah is it's not a very sturdy structure. It's just something that's basically very flimsily woven together. So what it means is that Yahweh is our protection when we dwell in a sukkah. So the first time we see a sukkah is in Genesis chapter 23, or Bereshit 33, starting in verse 16. Now this is after Yaakov, or Jacob, has just had a narrow escape with his brother Esau. Esau came out to meet him with 400 armed men, basically intent on killing him. So Yaakov, or Jacob, prays to Yahweh. Yahweh gives him favor in Esau's eyes. And then Esau returns that day and goes on his way to Seir. So Yaakov then journeyed to Sukkot and built himself a house, but he made booths, or Sukkot, for his livestock. Therefore, the name of that place was called Sukkot. We also see Sukkot appearing at Exodus, or Shemot chapter 12 in verse 36. So Yahweh gave our forefathers favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they granted them what they requested. Thus, they plundered the Egyptians. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. So the traditional understanding of this is that anytime we escape a place of captivity, or when we escape from danger, we dwell in Sukkot. So bear that thought in mind as we look at the other iterations of when we will dwell in Sukkot again. There's an escape from captivity, or escape from a place of danger, or in the future, we're escaping from this world and going to dwell in our Father's house in Sukkot. So Yahweh reiterates the command in Deuteronomy, or Devarim chapter 16, starting in verse 13. He says, "You shall observe the feast of Sukkot," or the Pilgrimage Feast of Sukkot, for 7 days. When you have gathered from your threshing floor and from your winepress. This is a reference to the first tithe, because the priesthood has to have something to work with. And if we love Yeshua, we want to help him build his global kingdom. The priesthood has to have funds to work with. Verse 14, he says, "And you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, and the Levite, the stranger and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates." This is a reference to the third tithe. We'll talk about that more in another place. We speak about it some in the Torah calendar study, but basically that's a reference to the third tithe. In verse 15, "For 7 days you shall keep a set-apart feast to Yahweh your Elohim in the place which Yahweh chooses." That's a reference to the second tithe, because that's the purpose of the second tithe, is so that we can go up to Yahweh's feast. He says, "Because Yahweh your Elohim will bless you in all your produce and in all the work of your hands, so that you surely rejoice." Now we need to remember this phrase, that we surely rejoice. And this is why Brother Judah traditionally calls the Feast of Sukkot the time of our joy. And we're going to see that again at the end of this presentation. So he says 3 times a year, all your males shall, at least all the males. Hopefully, if the whole family can go, good, so much the better. But at least all of our males. Now, this is when we dwell in the land. Just a quick comment. Well, we showed this in the Torah calendar study. There's a section from Deuteronomy 12 to Deuteronomy 16 that gives commandments for when we dwell in the land of Israel. So this is part of that same monologue. When we're outside the land of Israel, we do not need to go up to Jerusalem. It's great if you can do it. If you can go to Jerusalem, that's a very good thing to do, and take the family there. Change the way you look at Scripture, I promise you. But it's not necessary. And the reason we know that is because the Apostle Shaul, or Paul, didn't go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year when he was out on his missionary voyages. That's one of many proofs. But when we're in the dispersion, there is not a need to go up to Jerusalem to keep the 3 pilgrimage feasts. We only need to make the pilgrimages when we dwell in the land. But if we can make the pilgrimages, that's a great thing to do. So continuing the monologue from Deuteronomy 12 about these commandments of this Torah that apply, the rules that apply when we live in the land, Yahweh says, 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before Yahweh your Elohim in the place which he chooses. At Chag Hamatzot, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's a pilgrimage feast. At Chag Shavuot, that's the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. And at Chag Sukkot, that's the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. And they shall not appear before Yahweh empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of Yahweh your Elohim, which he has given you. And just to mention this briefly, a word to the wise needs to be sufficient. But again, there's a lot of people who consider that they want to be Yeshua's bride, but they don't want to help him build his kingdom. Well, so they sort of bury their minas, so to speak. But we know what happens to those who bury their minas. It doesn't end well for them. If we love Yeshua, a bride is described as a helpmeet. So what does Yeshua want help doing? He wants help building his ordered kingdom. We talk about that in Torah government and also in Acts 15 order. We're going to talk about that a lot more in future videos. You know, if we love our husband, we need to be helping him. And he's recording everything in a book. So if we want to be taken as the bride, we need to be eager to help him, because we don't serve a stupid Elohim. He knows who loves him and who doesn't. You know, for example, if you have a business, or if you've ever done hiring and firing, or you've been a leader in any kind of a project, you can always tell whose heart is in it, who truly wants to do the work, because it shows, and who's just there trying to collect a paycheck or whatever it is they're doing. Yahweh is the same way. So if this makes a difference in the material world, how much more to the King of Kings? Okay, so I said we would come back to the 4 species mentioned in Leviticus or Vayikra, chapter 23 and verse 40. So what Yahweh tells us to do now, to celebrate the feast, he says, and you shall take for yourselves on the first day. This is not something we need to have on the first day. This is something we need to take for ourselves on the first day. He says the fruit of beautiful trees. Now notice, he doesn't give us an exact genus and species. If you think the tree is beautiful and it has fruit, take it. He says the branches of palm trees. Okay, that's a genus. We don't have an exact species. And then the question arises, what happens if you don't have any palm trees around? Well, ideally, it's that you're going to have to pray about what to do there. But if you can take palm trees, take palm trees. And he says the boughs of leafy trees. So again, there's no genus and species listed, but if a tree is leafy, it could serve. And willows of the brook. So again, we got a genus, but no species. So if you have willows available, take the willows. If you don't have willows, you need to pray about what you need to do. But so Yahweh does not specify the exact genus and species, so do the very best that you can. Hopefully in the land of Israel, we'll be able to take all the 4 species again. Now the problem is, let's take a look at Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah chapter 8, starting in verse 13, we're going to see that the rabbis didn't take 4 species, they took 5. And we believe that that was a mistake on their part, because we are not supposed to add or subtract or to change Yahweh's word in any way. So Nehemiah chapter 8, starting in verse 13, it says, "Now on the second day, the heads of the fathers' houses of all the people, with the priests and the Levites, were gathered to Ezra the scribe in order to understand the words of the Torah. And they found written in the Torah, which Yahweh had commanded by Moshe, that the children of Israel should dwell in Sukkot or tabernacles or booths during the feast of the 7th month." Okay, so they're coming back from Babylon, and they're just coming back to the Torah. They're starting to learn what is the Torah all about. And they discovered that they should announce and proclaim in all their cities. Well, why are they not in Jerusalem already? But apparently they weren't all. But they should announce and proclaim in all their cities and in Jerusalem, saying, "Go out to the mountain and bring olive branches, branches of oil trees," whatever those are, because they're not olive branches, "myrtle branches, palm branches, and branches of leafy trees, to make booths, as it is written." Okay, well, they tried, okay? That's not 4 species, that's 5, and then they got 2 of them correct. They got the palm branches and the branches of leafy trees correct. Olive branches, oil trees, and myrtle branches, those are not commanded. But they made an effort, and apparently Yahweh honored that effort, so that's a good thing. Well, let's take a look in Deuteronomy, or Devarim, chapter 31, starting in verse 10. It says that Moshe commanded them, saying, "At the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of release," that's what's called a Shemitah. We explained that in the Torah calendar study. That happens once every 7 years, well, for 49 years of a 50, and then there's a Jubilee year to make a 50-year cycle, and then it begins all over again. So at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time, meaning Feast of Sukkot, in the year of release, the Shemitah, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before Yahweh your Elohim in the place which he chooses, which right now is Jerusalem, but if we're in the dispersion, that doesn't apply to us. "You shall read this Torah before all Israel in their hearing." Okay, and so we go through the best as we can figure out the next Shemitah, or land rest year. This is 2021 at the time of this filming. Our understanding is that next year will be a Shemitah year, and then 2029, 2036, 2043, 2050, and then we talk more about that in the Torah calendar study. But that's what they're supposed to do, is they're supposed to read the Torah during the Feast of Sukkot, when they come together in the 7th year, in the year of release. And we see that they did that in Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 18. So it says also, day by day, from the first day until the last day, he read from the book of the Torah of Elohim. Good job. And they kept the feast 7 days. And on the 8th day, there was a set apart assembly, according to the prescribed manner. So what this means is, if you have the opportunity next year in 2022, that's something you should do during that feast, is to read the entire Torah during the feast. So again, 2029 would be another year. We have those dates listed also in the Torah calendar study. So now there's a special ceremony. This is a rabbinic ceremony. It is not commanded. It's a rabbinic ceremony. Question comes up every year. We're going to talk about it. So this is from Wikipedia. It's a special rabbinic ceremony called Nisuch Hamayim. And it says, from Wikipedia, it says, when the temple in Jerusalem stood, a unique service, meaning Yahweh didn't command it, this is something the rabbis added. Okay, so we don't like to do things that the rabbis add. We don't do those things. But so when the temple in Jerusalem stood, a unique service that the rabbis added, which we don't want to do, was performed every morning throughout the Sukkot holiday. Okay, this was the Nisuch Hamayim. So literally, this is the pouring of the water. It's also called the water libation ceremony. Now, according to the Talmud, Sukkot is the time of year in which Elohim judges the world for rainfall. Therefore, this ceremony, like the taking of the 4 species, invokes Elohim's blessing for rain in its proper time. And that's a rabbinic understanding which we do not subscribe to. Now it continues. According to the Mishnah, so Tractate Sukkot 4 and 9 and 4 and 10, the water for the libation ceremony was drawn from the pool of Shiloam. And it was in the city of David and then carried up the Jerusalem Pilgrim Road to the temple. It says the joy that accompanied this procedure was palpable. But again, the only problem is that the rabbis are adding commandments to the Torah, and Yahweh strictly prohibits that. He says very, very clearly not to add commandments to his Torah. So, and then there's a big discussion that ensues, and this can get very involved and complex, but here's the short version. So in Yohanan or John chapter 7 and verse 37, it says, on the last day, that great day of the feast. Now, some people believe this is the 7th day of the feast. Others believe it was the 8th. So that's a whole discussion in and of itself. But on the last day, that great day of the feast, Yeshua stood and cried out, saying, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. We're talking about the drawing of the water. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. So certain people believe that this is an endorsement of the Nisuch Hamayim ceremony. We don't see it that way. So he says, but this he spoke concerning the Spirit, whom those believing in him would receive, for the set-apart Spirit was not yet given, because Yeshua was not yet glorified. And once again, water is symbolic of the Spirit. Therefore, many from the crowd, when they heard this saying, said, truly, this is the prophet. Others said, this is the Messiah. Now, we'll have to explain this more in the Torah calendar study, but there's several references to Nisuch Hamayim. There's also references to Hanukkah, and these are man-made feasts. Now, they celebrate certain things that you can say, well, these honor Yahweh, but you can say a lot of things honor Yahweh. The Christians say that Christmas and Easter are intended to honor Yahweh. The point is, Yahweh says, do not add and do not take away from my word. Because if you add and take away from my word, it's no longer my word. Now it's your word. And we don't do that here in Israel. So people can say, well, but Yeshua is talking about the water that's being drawn in the Nisuch Hamayim ceremony, and he's saying that the waters are going to come from him. Exactly. But just because he says the waters are going to come from him, that doesn't mean that he's endorsing Nisuch Hamayim. Just because he mentions Hanukkah, he's there at the time of Hanukkah, that doesn't mean he's endorsing Hanukkah. It means he's trying to point people in the right direction. He's saying, don't pay attention to Nisuch Hamayim, pay attention to me. Because all the Torah, Yeshua says, speaks of me. All right, now let's put this in some greater overall context. So in the study, Revelation and the End Times, we talk about the end time sequence, or what we call the Revelation timeline. So first there's 7 seals, then there's 7 trumpets, and then there's 7 cups or 7 bowls of judgment being poured out. And we talk about various analogies. And then after all that comes Armageddon, or what's also called the first war of Gog and Magog. Then after that comes the ingathering of the lost tribes, the lost and scattered of Israel. We talk about that in the Nazarene Israel study. We're talking about the Christians who are at the present moment ignorant of their identity as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. We're also talking about the remnant of Judah that lives outside the land. Those are going to be brought back to the land of Israel in what's called the ingathering. And then there's going to be what is sometimes, rightly or wrongly, referred to as the millennial reign of the Messiah. In actual fact, it's going to be the millennial reign of the Messiah's body, meaning Nazarene Israel, which is going to be given Yeshua's rod of iron. And we will rule and reign for 1,000 years with Yeshua's rod of iron. And then at the end of that time will come the second war of Gog and Magog, when Satan is loosed, and then we'll talk about the earth continuing for a little while next week. But in the context of all this, so the early context of this is Matthew chapter 24, the Great Tribulation coming to pass, and then Armageddon. But then there's an ingathering, and then there's 1,000-year reign, when Yeshua reigns over the earth through his body, Nazarene Israel, which is given his rod of iron to reign with. Now, in that context, we see further fulfillments of the Feast of Tabernacles. And we're going to talk about this. We're also going to see some of this next week. There's a lot of fulfillments of the Feast of Tabernacles. So in Zechariah chapter 14, starting in verse 16, it says, "And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, Yahweh of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." It says, "And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, Yahweh of hosts, on them there will be no rain." So this is kind of ruling over the nations with a rod of iron in a sense. If you don't come up to Jerusalem year by year to worship the King, you're not going to have any rain. Means you're not going to have any food. Okay, well, it says, "If the family of Egypt will not come up to enter in, they shall have no rain," meaning no food. "They shall receive the plague with which Yahweh strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. You starve to death." It says, "This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." So very important that we be there. Very important. We also see this in Ezekiel or Yechezkel chapter 45 and verse 25. Now notice the reference. It says, "In the 7th month, on the 15th day of the month." That's when the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Sukkot begins. It says, "At the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, he," referring to the prince or the Nasi, "shall do likewise for 7 days." Okay, we're talking about a 7-day feast. "According to the sin offering, the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the oil." We talk more in the Revelation study about why this will not be Yeshua. It's because he offers sin sacrifices for himself. Well, why does Yeshua need to offer a sin sacrifice for himself? Because Yeshua was the spotless and blemishless lamb. He's also going to have children. Okay, Yeshua doesn't have children. Yeshua is not going to take a human bride in that sense. Yeshua is in heaven waiting for us to become purified. He'll come and take us back up to heaven in spiritual form. In the resurrection, they are neither male nor female, but are as the messengers or the angels in heaven. Now, Acts 15 talks about the first century, but it has prophetic implications for today and also beyond the ingathering. So in Acts 15, the apostle Shaul and Barnabas had come up to Jerusalem because there was a discussion of what they were supposed to do in Antioch. We talk about that in the Nazarene Israel study. So in Maaseh or Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 12, it says, "Then all the multitude kept silent and listened to Barnabas and Shaul or Paul, declaring how many miracles and wonders Elohim had worked through them among the Gentiles. And after they had become silent, Yaakov or James answered, saying, 'Men and brethren, listen to me. Shimon or Peter or Kepha has declared how Elohim at the first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name." He's talking about Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, and then also those of the nations in Antioch in Acts chapter 11. He says, and with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written. After this I will return, and I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down. That's our job. We talk about that in Nazarene Scripture Studies, Volume 5. It's a very important 4-part series. We hope to do more videos on that in the future. But that's our job, and we need to be organized in order to do that. That's what we're supposed to be doing right now. So he says, after this, I will return and will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down. And I will rebuild its ruins, and I will set it up, so that the rest of mankind, very important, notice this, so that the rest of mankind, probably read Adam or Adam, may seek Yahweh, even all the Gentiles who are called by my name. That's us, says Yahweh, who does all these things. Now they're referring to Amos chapter 9, starting in verse 11. It says, where Yahweh says, on that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, and repair its damages. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old. Again, there's a very important 4-part series in Nazarene Scripture Studies, Volume 5. That's very good to check out in this context. He says, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, but we talk about that's probably actually Adam, and that was a scribal change or a scribal error, however you want to say that. He says, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name. Those are the Nazarenes. That's Nazarene Israel. Says Yahweh, who does this thing. And once again, we have a very important job to do regarding the tabernacle of David. So I encourage you, please, to check that 4-part series out. And again, hopefully we hope to do more video series on that in the future. But we also see in Isaiah, or Yeshayahu, chapter 4, starting in verse 1, it says, and in that day, so in this context, and in that day, 7 women, so women being representative of spiritual bodies, this might be 7 churches, or it might be 7 other spiritual groups, but 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own food and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by your name to take away our reproach. And we could do a whole video series just on that verse alone. But it says, and in that day, the branch of Yahweh shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and appealing for those of Israel who have escaped. So we're talking about after the tribulation, because the reference is to those who have escaped. It says, and it shall come to pass that he who is left in Sion, we're talking about the tiny remnant of Judah that's going to survive what's coming, and remains in Jerusalem will be called set apart or holy. Everyone who is recorded among the living in Jerusalem, again, it's not going to be many because they need to repent, and accept their Messiah and King. It says, when Yahweh has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, and purged the blood of Jerusalem from her midst, by the spirit of judgment and by the spirit of burning. So once again, Matthew 24, it's not going to be fun. Then Yahweh will create above every dwelling place of Mount Zion, and above her assemblies, a cloud and smoke by day, and the shining of a flaming fire by night, as it was in the wilderness when we left Egypt. For over all the glory there will be a covering, and there will be a tabernacle for shade in the daytime from heat, and for a place of refuge, and for a shelter from storm and rain. And remember how we talked about earlier, whenever we escape from captivity or whenever we escape from danger, Israel dwells in tabernacles. So in that context, now let's take a look again. We talk about Nisuch HaMayim, or the water libation ceremony. Let's take a look again. This comes from Talmud Tractate Sukkah, chapter 53. So according to Babylonian Talmud, now we do not believe the Talmud is inspired, but it's a very important historical reference for us. It says, according to Talmud Tractate Sukkah, chapter 53, during the Second Temple era, the priesthood lit 4 enormous golden candlesticks in the court of women. Within the temple, during the water libation ceremony, or Nisu Hamayim, the wicks were made from old priestly garments. Great symbolism there. It says, according to the Talmud, the light was so bright that there was not a courtyard in all of Jerusalem that was not illuminated by its light during the festival. And again, this is called the time of our joy. So this again corresponds to Yohanan or John chapter 8 and verse 12, where Yeshua spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. So again, this isn't necessarily an endorsement of Nisu Hamayim, of adding something to Yahweh's commandment. Rather, this is Yeshua saying, hey, you guys, don't pay attention to that. Pay attention to this. Because by dwelling in me and I in you, and Yeshua in the Father and the Father in him, that's what's going to restore the connection that was lost in the Garden of Eden. That's what receiving Yeshua's Spirit is all about. Because that's the symbolism of receiving his Spirit in Acts chapter 2, is that we are supposed to then live according to his Spirit and dwell in him and him in us, not quenching his Spirit. That's the main thing that we all need to remember. Now, the Catholic Church has their mythology that Yeshua was born on December the 25th, which is basically impossible. December the 25th is a converted pagan feast day. It's based on the winter solstice at December the 21st, and 4 days later symbolizes the rebirth of the sun. Now, that will be basing the calendar on the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars, which Yahweh strictly prohibits. In context, what makes a lot more sense, in fact, what makes perfect sense, is that Yeshua would have been born on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And then he would have been circumcised on the 8th day of the feast, in keeping with the Torah commandment. This way, just as Yeshua says, everything in the Torah speaks of him. Everything points to him. All we have to do is we have to know what we're looking at and know how to interpret what's called a remez, or a hint. So, for example, in Luke chapter 2 and verse 6, we're told that so it was that while Joseph and Miriam were there, meaning up at Jerusalem, keeping the feast, the days were completed for Miriam to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, or in context, in a sukkah, in a temporary dwelling, because there was no room for them at the inn. Now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. Now that's something that's not going to happen in the middle of winter, because it's cold in the land of Israel. The shepherds are not going to be living out in the fields in the middle of winter, but they are going to be living out in the fields at the end of the summer growing season. Why? Is because their flocks are going to be eating what's left of the harvest. They're going to be eating the stubble and the nubbins. They're going to be eating those kinds of things. But during the winter, there's nothing to eat, so they're going to have their flocks all penned up. It says, and behold, a messenger or a malach or an angel of Yahweh stood before them, and the glory of Yahweh shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. Then the messenger or the angel or the malach said to them, do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Messiah, Yahweh. Notice the hint or the remez, the term joy. It says, then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the young child. When you found him, bring back word to me, that I may come and worship him also. And when they heard the king, they departed. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy, because the King, Messiah, was born unto us. That's why it's called the time of our joy. And that's why we should take joy in the Feast of Sukkot, in the Pilgrimage Feast of Tabernacles, because we're going to dwell in tents again. This is speaking about the time of the ingathering before we come back to the land. Many of us will live to see this day. As it says in Hosea or Hoshea, chapter 12 and verse 9, it says, "But I am Yahweh your Elohim. Ever since the land of Egypt, I will again make you dwell in tents, as in the days of the appointed feast." It's important that we be there at the feast at the right time with the fullest amount of His Spirit that we can possibly have. We want to know about what is important to our husband. We want to know what's important to Yahweh. So we can learn about the technical details of Chag Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, and the rest of the feasts of Yahweh in the Torah calendar study. We can find out when it is exactly we're supposed to be there, both in the Torah calendar study and in another study called Establishing the Head of the Year. It's very important not only to be there with the Spirit, with enough of His Spirit to sustain us during these coming end times, but we need to be there at the right time. Don't miss the wedding. At the time of this recording, most of the Messianics, they're keeping it a month too late. It's not based on spring. It's not based on fall. It's not based on the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Rather, it's based on the very first sheaf of barley, symbolic of Yeshua, our wave sheaf. So don't miss the feast. Be sure to be there at the right time. So educate yourself. Study to show yourself approved. These are the things that we need to do if we're going to be there for the consummation and the wedding feast. Friends, this is what it's all about. Yahweh is seeking a bride for His Son. He's seeking a bride that wants to help His Son build His kingdom. Let's be that bride. And to be that bride, we need to know what His plan is. We need to know what the Father's commandments are. So let's educate ourselves in these things, and let's discipline ourselves to do them and take joy in this great time of our joy. Shalom.